Michelle Bradford's hand froze mid-handshake. The conference room spun around her as she stared into the young man's face, specifically into his hazel eyes, with that unmistakable amber ring around the iris. Eyes she had seen only once before, 20 years ago, in the face of the newborn son she gave up for adoption. Her clipboard clattered to the floor. I need a moment," she whispered, stumbling backward toward the door as 20 confused pharmaceutical sales representatives watched their senior hospital administrator flee the room like she'd seen a ghost. If you're loving this story already, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more incredible true stories. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Michelle made it to her office before her legs gave out. She collapsed into her chair, trembling hands covering her face. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be him. But those eyes, she would recognize them anywhere. They haunted her dreams, her waking moments, every quiet second of the last 2 decades. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and pulled up the vendor meeting roster. There it was. David Morrison, age 20, pharmaceutical sales representative for Medicare Solutions. Morrison. The name meant nothing to her, but the age, the timing. It all aligned perfectly with the most painful decision she'd ever made. 20 years ago, Michelle had been a different person entirely. At 22, she was a college dropout, 6 months pregnant, and sleeping in her car behind a 24-hour diner where she worked double shifts. The father, Brandon Pierce, had walked away the moment she refused to terminate the pregnancy. "You're on your own," he'd said, and he meant it. She never heard from him again. The adoption agency had been her only option. She remembered sitting in that sterile office, holding her newborn son, David, she'd named him, knowing these would be her last moments with him. The adoptive parents, Dr. Robert and Patricia Morrison, seemed like everything she could never be. Stable, successful, warm, ready. They promised to love him like their own. They promised to keep the name David, the one thing she begged them to preserve. Michelle had asked for only one photograph. A single Polaroid of David's face, his tiny eyes barely open, showing just a hint of that distinctive hazel with the amber ring. She'd kept that photo in a locked box in her closet for 20 years, taking it out on his birthday every single year, wondering who he'd become. And now he was here, in her hospital, selling pharmaceuticals. Michelle spent the rest of the day researching. David Morrison, raised in Portland. Only child, business degree from Portland State University. Sales representative for Medicare Solutions for the past 2 years. But the deeper she dug, the more her heart broke. His adoptive parents, the Morrisons, had died in a car accident 2 years ago. David had been working ever since, taking on extra territories, covering weekend shifts at medical conferences. The family she'd chosen to give him everything had been taken from him. He was alone, just like she'd been 20 years ago. The next morning, Michelle forced herself to maintain composure during the second vendor presentation meeting. David sat in the front row, his briefcase organized beside him, occasionally pushing his dark hair back from his forehead, a gesture that struck her as familiar, though she couldn't say why. When the session ended, he approached her desk. "Ms. Bradford, I wanted to apologize if my presence yesterday caused any issue. You seemed unwell." His voice was gentle, concerned. Michelle's throat constricted. No issue at all, just a sudden headache. I'm fine now." "Good." He smiled slightly. "I'm looking forward to working with your hospital. Everyone says you run the tightest ship in the region when it comes to vendor relations." After he left, Michelle sat in the empty conference room for 30 minutes, crying silently. The following weeks became a special kind of torture. David's company had won a major contract with the hospital, which meant he was there constantly. Meetings about supply chains, presentations to department heads, negotiations over pricing. Michelle learned he was professional but struggling. He worked territory coverage across 3 states, often driving through the night between appointments. Other sales reps talked about their families waiting at home. David just moved on to the next hospital, the next meeting. Michelle began small interventions, careful to disguise them as standard hospital policy. She arranged for preferred vendor parking passes. She randomly scheduled his meetings during reasonable hours rather than early morning or late evening slots. She left anonymous coffee shop gift cards at the vendor check-in desk, anything to ease his burden without revealing herself. But proximity bred connection. During a particularly difficult contract negotiation, where hospital executives were being unreasonably harsh about pricing, Michelle found David afterward in the parking lot, sitting in his car with his head against the steering wheel. "I'm sorry about that meeting," she said, approaching his open window. "They were out of line." He looked up, surprised. "It's okay. It's part of the job. That doesn't make it right." Michelle hesitated. "Are you okay?" And somehow they ended up talking for an hour. David opened up about losing his parents, about feeling completely alone in the world, about wondering if he was strong enough to keep going without them. He talked about how his adoptive father had been a doctor, how he'd originally wanted to follow that path, but couldn't afford medical school after his parents died. Sales was practical, paid the bills, but sometimes felt hollow. Michelle listened, her heart shattering and rebuilding with every word, wanting desperately to tell him he wasn't alone, that he'd never been alone, that she'd thought about him every single day for 20 years. "I wish I'd had someone like you in my life sooner," David said as they parted ways. "Thank you for listening, Ms. Bradford." "Michelle? Please, call me Michelle." She barely made it back inside the building before breaking down completely. It couldn't last. Secrets never do. Dr. Elena Vasquez had worked with Michelle for 15 years and had known her back when she was pregnant. One afternoon, Elena cornered Michelle in her office, closing the door firmly behind her. "That's your son, isn't it? David Morrison, the pharmaceutical rep." Michelle's silence was confirmation enough. "Oh, Michelle." Elena sat down heavily. "How long have you known?" "Since the first day." His eyes, they're identical to the photo I took 20 years ago. "And you haven't told him?" "How can I?" Michelle's voice cracked. "What right do I have? I gave up that right 2 decades ago. I gave him away, Elena. I don't get to waltz back into his life now just because it's convenient for me." Elena leaned forward, her expression serious. "You need to tell him. Secrets like this never stay buried. And when he finds out you knew and said nothing, and he will find out, it'll destroy any relationship you might have built. He deserves the truth." But Michelle couldn't find the courage. Not yet. What she didn't know was that David had been searching too. For years, David had been trying to find his birth mother. After his adoptive parents died, that search became desperate. He needed to know he came from somewhere, that he mattered to someone before the Morrisons. Recently, Oregon had unsealed older adoption records. David had finally gotten a name, Michelle Bradford. It took him 2 weeks to confirm that Michelle Bradford, his birth mother, was the same Michelle Bradford who ran hospital administration at his biggest client hospital. The same woman who'd been kind to him, helping him, watching over him. The same woman who'd said nothing. David stood outside Michelle's office door, adoption papers trembling in his hands, rage and betrayal and grief warring in his chest. Finally, he knocked. Michelle looked up, smiled, and then saw his face. The papers in his hand. Her smile died. "You knew," David said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door. "This whole time you knew who I was, and you said nothing." "David, Don't," his voice shook. "Don't try to explain. I found your name in my adoption records 3 weeks ago. I've been watching you, trying to figure out if I should say something, wondering why you were being so kind to me. I thought maybe you didn't recognize me. Maybe you'd forgotten, but you knew. From the first day, you knew." Michelle stood, tears already streaming down her face. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what? That I'd be angry you gave me up? I already knew that. You made that choice 20 years ago." David's voice rose. "What I didn't know was whether you ever thought about me, whether I mattered to you at all, whether giving me away haunted you, or if you just moved on with your life." "You think I moved on?" Michelle's voice broke. "David, I have thought about you every single day for 20 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I missed. I kept one photo, one single photo, and I've looked at it 10,000 times, wondering who you were, if you were happy, if you were loved. Then why didn't you tell me? David's anger crumbled into pain. When I introduced myself, when we talked in the parking lot, when I told you I was alone, why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I didn't deserve to. Michelle collapsed back into her chair. I gave up the right to be your mother 20 years ago. I saw how professional you were, how hard you worked, and I thought maybe I'd made the right choice, that you'd turned out better without me. And then I learned about your parents and I saw you struggling, and I wanted so badly to help, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if you'd want me in your life. I didn't know if I had any right to try. That wasn't your choice to make alone. David's voice was quieter now, but no less painful. I looked for you for years, Michelle. Years. Do you know what it's like growing up adopted? Always feeling like part of you is missing? I had wonderful parents. I loved them. But I still wondered. I still needed to know where I came from. Michelle reached into her desk drawer with trembling hands and pulled out a worn lockbox. She opened it, revealing the Polaroid, a hospital bracelet, and a thick journal. These are letters, she whispered. I wrote you a letter every year on your birthday. I never sent them because I had no right to burden you with my guilt. But you were never forgotten, David. Not for a single day. David stared at the journal, his hands hovering over it but not quite touching. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted. I'm so angry at you, but I've been searching for you my whole life, and now that I've found you, I don't know what I want anymore. I understand if you hate me, Michelle said. I understand if you never want to see me again. But please know that giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done, and seeing you here now has been both the best and worst thing that's ever happened to me. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, David spoke. I need time. I need to process this, but I don't want to disappear. I just need time. Take all the time you need, Michelle whispered. David stood to leave, then paused at the door. Did you mean it? That you thought about me every day? Every single day. He nodded slowly and left. Michelle didn't see David for 3 weeks. His company sent a different sales representative to cover his territory. She respected his space, though every day without contact felt like losing him all over again. She drafted her resignation letter twice, thinking maybe it would be easier for him if she left the hospital. But Elena talked her down both times. Give him time, Elena advised. You've waited 20 years. You can wait a little longer. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Michelle received a call from a small community clinic on the outskirts of town. They'd received a massive pharmaceutical donation, medications for underserved patients, supplies they desperately needed but couldn't afford. The donor wanted to remain anonymous, but the delivery slip had David Morrison's signature on it. Michelle drove to the clinic and confirmed the donation was worth over $50,000 in retail value. David had used his own commission money and called in every favor with his company to make it happen. When she asked the clinic director why this particular clinic, the answer made her cry. He said his father used to volunteer here, that it meant something to his family. After that, Michelle started noticing other things. Anonymous donations to the hospital's charity care fund, scholarship contributions to nursing programs, medical supply drives organized through David's company. He was channeling his grief and his drive into helping others, just like his adoptive father had taught him. One evening, Michelle was working late when there was a knock on her office door. David stood there, looking tired but calmer than the last time she'd seen him. Can we talk? He asked. They talked for hours. David had been seeing a therapist, Dr. Simone Reed, who specialized in adoption trauma. She'd helped him process his feelings, his anger, his grief, and she'd suggested that maybe he and Michelle could benefit from therapy together. I'm still hurt, David said honestly. I'm still working through a lot of complicated feelings, but I'm also tired of being alone. I'm tired of having all these questions and no one to ask. And I realized something. I've spent my whole life wondering about my birth mother, building up this image of you in my head. But I never got to know the actual person. Maybe it's time I did. Michelle's breath caught. I would like that very much. They started slowly. Weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Reed, awkward at first, then gradually more open. Michelle learned about David's childhood, the soccer games, the science fairs, the family camping trips, how his father had inspired him to want to help people, even if the path looked different than originally planned. David learned about Michelle's journey, the poverty she'd clawed her way out of, the degree she'd eventually finished, the career she'd built from nothing. Michelle showed David the letters she'd written. David read them, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that she'd never stopped being his mother even after giving him away. He showed her his adoptive parents' wedding album, their family photos, letting her see the life he'd lived without her. A good life, a loved life. Thank you, David said one afternoon during therapy, looking at Michelle directly, for giving me to them. I know it cost you everything, but they gave me a beautiful childhood. I wouldn't change that. They gave you what I couldn't, Michelle replied. I'll always be grateful to them for that. Months passed. Their relationship evolved into something neither had expected. Not quite the mother-son bond that might have been, but something unique and precious nonetheless. David started joining Michelle for coffee before his sales calls at the hospital. They'd text each other throughout the week. Small things, but meaningful. One Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the truth came out, Michelle and David visited the Morrison family grave. Michelle laid flowers and knelt beside the headstones. Thank you, she whispered to Robert and Patricia Morrison. Thank you for loving him when I couldn't. Thank you for being the parents I couldn't be. Thank you for teaching him compassion and generosity. I'll never forget what you gave him. David helped her stand, and they walked back to the car in comfortable silence. Nearly a year after that first shocking recognition, Michelle and David sat together in a coffee shop near the hospital during David's lunch break. They were discussing a new charitable initiative David was developing when a young woman rushed over to their table. David, I've been calling you. She was pretty, bright-eyed, wearing business casual attire with a hospital volunteer badge. Sarah, I'm sorry, my phone's been on silent. David stood, smiling more freely than Michelle had ever seen. Michelle, this is Sarah Whitmore. She coordinates the hospital volunteer program. Sarah, this is Michelle Bradford. She's important to me. Sarah shook Michelle's hand warmly. Oh, you're the one David talks about all the time. It's so nice to finally meet you. As Michelle watched David and Sarah chat animatedly, she felt a warm sensation in her chest. Not quite closure, because some wounds never fully close, but something close to peace. David was building a life. He was happy, successful, making a difference in people's lives. And now, impossibly, she got to be a small part of that life. Later that evening, as Michelle drove home, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The scared 22-year-old girl sleeping in her car seemed like a lifetime ago. The woman who'd given up her son to give him a better life had made an impossible choice with impossible consequences. But somehow, despite everything, the pain, the secrets, the years of separation, they'd found their way back to each other. Not as traditional family, perhaps, but as something real and chosen and hard-won. Michelle pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at her phone. A text from David. Thanks for meeting Sarah. She really liked you. Coffee tomorrow before my morning meetings. Michelle smiled, tears blurring her vision, and typed back, I'd love that. 20 years ago, she'd looked into her newborn son's eyes and made the hardest decision of her life. Today, looking into those same eyes, older now, belonging to a man she was just beginning to know, she understood that love doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes love is letting go. Sometimes love is staying away. And sometimes, if you're incredibly lucky, love is finding your way back despite everything and building something new from the pieces of what was lost. She would never be his mother the way Patricia Morrison had been. She'd never have those childhood memories, those formative years. But she could be in his life now. She could be someone he chose to keep around, someone he trusted, someone who mattered. And that was more than she'd ever dreamed possible on that day she recognized his eyes across a conference room. Those distinctive hazel eyes, with the amber ring that had haunted her dreams, and finally, miraculously, brought them back together. What an incredible journey of loss, pain, and ultimate redemption. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories. We'll see you in the next video.